Close your eyes for just a second and picture a Victorian woman. Go on, really see her. She is standing very straight, in a long dark dress that covers her from her chin down to the floor. Her hair is pinned up tight. Her hands are folded. She looks proper. She looks careful. She looks like the kind of woman who would never do anything wild or dangerous with her body. Now let me tell you what is actually true. That same woman might have rubbed a thin paste on her cheeks every morning, a paste made partly from arsenic, the very same poison people use to kill rats, because it made her skin look pale and glowing in candlelight. That same woman might have worn a beautiful green dress to a ball, a dress so bright and lovely that everyone in the room complimented her, not knowing that the green dye itself was slowly poisoning her skin with every step she took. That same woman might have carried a small bottle in her purse filled with smelling salt strong enough to burn your nose, just in case her own corset squeezed her ribs so tightly that she stopped being able to breathe in public. This is not a costume drama. This is not something a movie made up to shock you. This was an ordinary Tuesday. So here is where I want to start tonight. Not with lace and manners and polite tea parties, because that version of Victorian women, the version you probably grew up believing, the calm, modest, buttoned-up picture, that version is only half true, and maybe not even half. Underneath the corsets and the long skirts, there was a world of strange objects, dangerous fashions, and quiet desperation that most people alive today have never heard about. And some of it is so strange, so unexpected, that once I tell you, you will never look at an old photograph of a Victorian woman the same way again. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you are lying in a warm bed somewhere in the American Midwest, blankets pulled up, phone propped against a pillow. Maybe you are in England itself. Maybe even walking distance from streets these very women once walked down, wearing the very dresses I am about to describe. Maybe you're somewhere the Victorians never even drew correctly on their maps, a place that existed long before them, and will exist long after all of us too. Wherever you are, just know that you are not really alone right now. You are joining a small, quiet circle of people who like their history slow, honest, and a little bit strange right before they fall asleep. And speaking of strange, here is something for you to do while you get comfortable. Down in the comments, tell me one topic you want me to dig into next. It can be anything. A person, a place, an object, a mystery that has been sitting in the back of your mind for years. I have gone digging through some very odd corners of history to bring you tonight's episode. So trust me, whatever you throw at me, I have probably already dug through something weirder. Now, let yourself sink into the mattress a little more. You do not need to keep your eyes open for this. You do not need to watch a single thing on the screen. This is built to be heard, not watched, so let your eyelids get heavy whenever they want to. My voice will still be here, walking you slowly through history, long after your eyes have closed. Let's start with the dress I mentioned a moment ago, the green one. In the 1850s and 60s, a certain shade of green became incredibly fashionable across England. It was bright, almost glowing, unlike any green fabric people had seen before. It showed up in ball gowns, in hair ornaments, in gloves, even in the fake leaves used to decorate hats. Women loved it. It made them stand out in a crowded room lit by candles and gas lamps. This color had a name. It was called Sheely's green, named after the chemist who first created it using a compound made with arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The same poison used in mystery novels to kill off characters quietly. Nobody thought much of it at first, because the danger was not obvious right away. A woman wearing the dress for one evening felt nothing unusual. But the women who made these dresses, the seamstresses and artificial flower makers who spent all day, every day, cutting and shaping and stitching fabric dyed with this arsenic green, they began getting sick. Their skin developed sores. Their fingernails turned strange colors. Some of them began losing patches of hair. A few of them, tragically, died from breathing in the toxic dust that came off the fabric hour after hour, day after day, in poorly ventilated workrooms. There was one case, widely reported in London newspapers at the time, of a young woman named Matilda Schur. She worked making artificial flowers using this arsenic dye. She died at just 19 years old. But we are not doing this quickly, and we're not doing this loudly. This is not the kind of History Channel that yells at you with dramatic music and flashing text. This is the kind where I sit with you quietly, like an old friend walking you slowly through a museum after closing hours, when all the lights are dim and there is nobody else around to rush you along. So settle in. Let your body get heavy against the bed. There is no test at the end of this. There is no need to remember every single detail. Just let the story wash over you slowly, the way water moves over stones in a riverbed, wearing them down gently over a very long time. Because right now, somewhere in a museum drawer in London, there is still a fragment of that original arsenic green fabric, faded now, harmless after all these years, sitting quietly behind glass. And somewhere in old family attics across England, there are still tiny glass, smelling salt bottles, empty now, waiting for someone to ask the question we are about to spend the rest of tonight answering together. What was it really like to be a woman getting dressed every single morning in Victorian England? Let's find out. Here is the picture most of us walked away with, whether we learned it from an old black and white film, a school textbook, or just from the general feeling that floats around any time someone says the word Victorian. A woman in a plain dark dress, buttoned to the throat, sitting quietly in a parlor, hands folded, eyes down, waiting patiently for her husband to come home. Modest, restrained, a little bit boring, if we are being honest with ourselves. The kind of woman who fainted at the sight of an ankle and thought too much conversation was improper. This picture did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere very specific, and once you know where it came from, the whole thing starts to look a little less like history and a little more like branding. Much of what we think we know about Victorian women actually comes from later generations looking backward with their own agendas. In the early 20th century, right after the First World War, when the entire world felt like it had been torn apart, a lot of people looked back at the Victorian era with a kind of aching nostalgia. They remembered it, or imagined it, as calm, orderly, safe. Writers and filmmakers in the decades that followed leaned into this image hard, because it made for a comforting contrast against a modern world that felt chaotic and uncertain. Hollywood costume dramas in the 1930s and 40s polished this image even further, dressing actresses in beautiful, clean, perfectly fitted gowns that had almost nothing to do with what real women actually wore day to day. So the modest, prim Victorian woman you carry in your head is not really a historical figure. She is closer to a character invented decades after the fact, stitched together from nostalgia, film costume budgets, and a comforting story we wanted to believe about the past. Now let's set that character aside gently and look at the record instead. Real Victorian women, especially working women, which made up the vast majority of the population, did not spend their days sitting quietly in parlors. They spent their days doing hard physical labor in factories and laundries, in other people's homes as servants, often for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch. Their clothing reflected that reality far more than any fashion plate ever could. A working-class woman's dress was not the elegant silk gown you see in period dramas. It was often wool or coarse cotton, patched more than once, hemmed shorter than fashion dictated simply because dragging fabric through mud and factory floors all day was not practical. And here is something that tends to surprise people the most. Underneath all those layers of skirt, Victorian women's undergarments were not always as modest as you might assume. For much of the century, women's drawers, the undergarment worn beneath the petticoats, were actually open at the crotch, not out of some scandalous reason, but purely for practicality. Using the bathroom while wearing 5 or 6 layers of heavy skirts and petticoats was already difficult enough. Closed undergarments would have made it nearly impossible without completely undressing every single time. So the idea that Victorian women were covered from head to toe in every single way, with no exceptions, starts to fall apart the moment you look closely at what they were actually wearing underneath everything else. The corset itself deserves a closer, more honest look too, because popular culture has turned it into something almost cartoonish. You've probably seen the scene in a movie where a poor woman gets tied into a corset so tight that she can barely stand, gasping, while maid pulls the laces with both feet braced against the bed frame. This did happen, but historians are careful to point out that this extreme version was far from universal. It existed mostly among a smaller group of fashionable elite women chasing an extreme silhouette, and even among them, opinions were mixed, and plenty of doctors at the time wrote furious articles warning against the health risks of tight lacing. Most working women wore what were called stays, a simpler, sturdier undergarment that provided support and shape without crushing the body into an impossible hourglass. A woman doing laundry all day or standing at a factory machine for 12 hours needed to breathe and bend, not faint from lack of oxygen. So when people today imagine every single Victorian woman walking around with her ribs compressed into a wasp shape, that image is really describing a narrow slice of upper-class fashion, not the daily reality for the millions of ordinary women who made up the backbone of the era. This gap between the fashion plate and the daily reality shows up again and again once you start looking closely at the historical record. Fashion magazines of the era, publications like the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine, printed beautiful illustrations of elegant dresses meant to represent an aspirational ideal, not an everyday reality. These magazines were something like the Instagram of their day, showing curated, idealized versions of how a fashionable life should look, while the actual lived experience of most readers looked very different. A domestic servant reading that magazine on her one afternoon off each week was not going home to put on that exact gown. She was going home to mend the same worn dress she had been wearing all month. There is also the matter of color, which surprises people almost every time I mention it. We tend to picture Victorian women dressed entirely in dark, somber colors, black, gray, deep brown. But for most of the era, color was everywhere. Women wore bright blues, rich purples, deep reds, vivid greens like the arsenic lace shade we talked about earlier. The dark, somber wardrobe we associate with the whole era actually comes largely from one specific historical event and one specific woman, which we will get to shortly, because her personal grief accidentally reshaped fashion rules for an entire nation. And then there's the matter of modesty itself, which turns out to be far more complicated than the simple story suggests. Yes, Victorian society placed enormous pressure on women to appear proper and restrained in public. But underneath that public performance, there was a thriving world of romance novels considered scandalous by critics, private letters between women that modern historians still debate the true nature of, and a flourishing, if officially condemned, trade in what the era euphemistically called indecent photography. The public face of Victorian modesty and the private reality of Victorian life were often two very different things, existing side by side, each pretending the other did not exist. So here's where we land before we go further back to see where all of this actually began. The Victorian woman you learned about, calm, covered, endlessly proper, is not a lie exactly, but she's only one thin layer of a much thicker, stranger, more complicated reality. Underneath the corset that may or may not have been laced dangerously tight, underneath the dress that may have been dyed with poison or patched from years of hard wear, underneath the modest expression she wore in public, there was a woman navigating a world of intense physical demands, strict social rules, dangerous fashion trends, and quiet contradictions that rarely made it into the paintings hung in museums today. To understand how this all came together, we need to go back much further than the Victorian era itself. We need to look at where some of these strange clothing customs actually began. Long before Queen Victoria ever took the throne, in objects and traditions that were already centuries old by the time, they became fashionable strangeness in 19th century England. Let's go back, slowly, to a specific object. Not a dress, not a hat, not a piece of jewelry. A cage. In 1856, a patent was filed in England for something called the cage crinoline. Picture a structure made of thin, flexible steel hoops connected by strips of fabric tape, worn underneath a skirt to make it flare out dramatically from the waist. Before this invention, women achieved a similar wide-skirted shape by wearing multiple layers of heavy petticoats stacked one on top of another, sometimes 5 or 6 layers deep, which was exhausting to wear and nearly impossible to wash and maintain. The steel cage crinoline solved that problem in one clever stroke. A woman could now achieve the same dramatic silhouette with a fraction of the weight and only one lightweight structure underneath. This single object, this simple steel cage, tells us almost everything about how fashion actually spreads and transforms in history. It was not invented by royalty. It was not commanded into existence by the church. It was invented because someone, quite practically, was trying to solve a problem that ordinary women complained about constantly: the sheer physical burden of wearing enough fabric to create a fashionable shape. Once the crinoline appeared, it spread with incredible speed across every level of society, because for the first time, a fashionable silhouette that used to require wealth and multiple servants to help dress you suddenly became achievable by working women too, at a much lower cost. But to understand why women wanted that wide, dramatic skirt shape in the first place, we have to look even further back into ideas about the female body that had already been circulating in Europe for centuries before Victoria was even born. The basic idea of shaping the body with structured undergarments goes back at least to the 16th century, where wealthy European women wore an early form of corset, sometimes called a pair of bodies, made from layers of stiffened linen or leather, occasionally reinforced with whalebone. This was not originally about extreme tightness or an hourglass shape. It was about achieving a smooth, rigid posture that signaled control, discipline, and social status. A woman who could afford a structured garment like this was a woman who did not need to move quickly, bend easily, or perform hard physical labor. Her body itself became a visible symbol of wealth and leisure. This idea, The body as a visible symbol of status is really the seed that grew into almost everything strange we associate with Victorian women's fashion centuries later. The tighter the waist, the more restricted the movement, the more layers of fabric involved, the more clearly a woman announced to everyone around her that she belonged to a class of people who did not need to labor with their hands. Fashion historians who study this pattern point out something fascinating here. The most extreme, restrictive, physically demanding fashions almost always appeared among the wealthiest women, not the poorest, because only the wealthy could afford to be physically limited by their own clothing. Now let's talk about where the earliest record of arsenic green fabric actually comes from, because this too has a very specific, almost accidental origin point. In 1814, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele discovered a way to create an incredibly vivid green pigment using copper arsenite. This was decades before Victoria took the throne. For years, this pigment was used mostly in wallpaper and paint, giving rooms in wealthy homes a beautiful jewel-tone green that had never been achievable before with older, duller pigments. It was not until fashion designers realized this same vivid pigment could be applied to fabric dye that the danger moved from wallpaper into women's actual clothing, worn directly against their skin for hours at a time. This is a pattern that shows up again and again once you start tracing origins carefully. Almost none of the strange or dangerous fashion trends we associate with Victorian women were invented specifically for women or invented with any intention of harm. They were borrowed, adapted, and repurposed from entirely different original uses: industrial dye, decorative paint, older aristocratic garments, and slowly folded into fashionable clothing as society searched endlessly for new ways to display beauty, wealth, and status. Mourning clothing follows a similar path if we trace it back far enough. The custom of wearing black clothing after a death did not begin in Victorian England. It stretches back through European history for centuries, tied to older religious traditions about grief, humility, and respect for the dead. What changed during the Victorian era was not the existence of mourning clothing itself, but the incredible detail and rigid structure that developed around exactly how long a woman needed to wear it, what fabric was appropriate at each stage of grief, and how gradually she was allowed to return to color and pattern. This elaborate structure, sometimes called the etiquette of mourning, became almost its own fashion industry, with specific shops in London dedicated entirely to selling mourning attire, and specific fabrics like crepe becoming instantly recognizable symbols of a woman's grief to everyone who saw her walking down the street. There's a particular object connected to this mourning tradition that most people today have never heard of, and it tells us something quietly moving about how ordinary women process loss during this period. Mourning jewelry, often made using a small lock of the deceased person's actual hair, woven into intricate patterns and sealed inside lockets, brooches, or rings, was extremely common across all social classes. A woman might wear a piece of jewelry every single day containing a physical piece of her dead child, her dead husband, or her dead mother, worn quietly against her skin as a private, constant connection to someone she had lost. This was not seen as morbid at the time. It was seen as tender, practical, and deeply normal, a way of keeping a loved one physically close even after death. So when we ask where all of this strangeness actually began, the honest answer is that it did not begin in one single place or one single moment. It grew slowly out of centuries-old ideas about status and the body, out of industrial chemistry experiments that had nothing to do with fashion originally, out of religious traditions about grief that long predate England itself, and out of the constant, very human desire to look beautiful, to signal belonging, and to process loss in a way that felt tangible and real. By the time Victoria took the throne in 1837, all of these separate threads, the corset tradition, the crinoline innovation waiting just around the corner, the arsenic dye already circulating in wallpaper, the deep-rooted mourning customs were already sitting quietly in place, waiting for the specific pressures of a new era, a new queen, and a rapidly industrializing nation to pull them all together into the strange, distinctive fashion world we now associate with her name. And that pulling together did not happen by accident. It happened because of power. Specific people, specific institutions, specific historical pressures reached into these older traditions and reshaped them into something new, something that served very particular purposes far beyond simply looking nice. To understand how a private steel cage worn under a skirt or a small locket containing human hair became tools that entire social systems used to control, define, and display women's place in society, we need to look closely at exactly who held the power to reshape fashion during this era and exactly what they wanted that fashion to say. Let's start with one woman, because in this particular story, one woman's private grief ended up reshaping the wardrobe of an entire nation for decades. In December of 1861, Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, died of what was recorded at the time as typhoid fever. Victoria was devastated in a way that went far beyond typical royal mourning. She withdrew from public life almost entirely for years afterward, and when she did appear in public, she wore black. Not for the standard mourning period that etiquette required at the time, which was usually a year or two, but for the rest of her life. She wore black for the remaining 40 years that she lived after her husband's death. Now, here is where power enters the picture. Queen Victoria was not simply a grieving widow living quietly in a private home. She was the most visible woman in the entire British Empire, watched, photographed, discussed, and copied by millions of women who saw her as the ultimate model of proper femininity. When she continued wearing black year after year, long after tradition required it, it sent a powerful, unspoken message throughout British society about what appropriate feminine grief was supposed to look like. Women across the country, from aristocrats to shop owners' wives, began extending their own mourning periods, adopting stricter mourning wardrobes, partly out of genuine cultural pressure, and partly simply because the most powerful woman in the country had made permanent grief fashionable, whether she intended to or not. This is a pattern worth sitting with for a moment, because it shows something important about how power actually works in shaping culture. Victoria did not issue a royal decree commanding women to wear black. She did not need to. Her personal choice, repeated visibly and consistently over decades, quietly rewrote social expectations for an entire nation, simply because of the position she held. Power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves through something as quiet as one woman's wardrobe choice, echoing outward until millions of other women feel a pull to follow along. The church played its own role in shaping fashion during this era too, though far more directly than Victoria's quiet influence. Religious teachings throughout the Victorian period emphasized modesty, humility, and control of the body as expressions of moral character. Clergy frequently preached against what they saw as excessive vanity in dress, particularly criticizing women who wore what were considered overly elaborate or revealing fashions. This religious pressure did not stop fashion trends from happening, but merchants and the rapidly growing textile industry perhaps reshaped Victorian fashion more thoroughly than any other single force, simply through sheer economic power. The Industrial Revolution transformed how quickly and cheaply fabric could be produced, dyed, and distributed across the country. New chemical dyes, like the arsenic green we discussed earlier, or the vivid purple dye called mauveine, discovered accidentally by an 18-year-old chemist named William Perkin in 1856, allowed clothing manufacturers to produce colors that had never been affordable or achievable at scale before. Perkin's discovery of mauveine in particular kicked off what historians sometimes call a color revolution, as this brand new synthetic purple dye became wildly fashionable almost overnight, worn by everyone from factory workers to the Queen herself, showing just how quickly a single chemical accident could ripple outward and reshape what an entire nation considered beautiful. Department stores, a genuinely new invention during this era, also reshaped fashion by making trend-driven shopping accessible to a much wider range of women than ever before. Stores like Whiteley's in London allowed middle-class women, not just the wealthy elite, to browse and purchase fashionable items in one location, creating an entirely new culture of shopping as entertainment and social activity, which further accelerated how quickly new trends could spread across the population. So when we look closely at everything reshaping Victorian women's fashion during this period, a queen's private grief, the church's moral teachings, colonial trade routes stretching across continents, military campaigns abroad, and a rapidly industrializing textile economy driven by merchants hungry for profit, we start to see something important. The strange, elaborate, sometimes dangerous fashions Victorian women wore were never simply personal choices made in isolation. They were the visible result of enormous, often invisible forces, empire, religion, industry, and grief, all pressing down on individual women's closets, shaping what they wore, why they wore it, and what wearing it was meant to say about who they were. What started centuries earlier as a simple practical solutions to real problems, staying warm, achieving good posture, expressing genuine grief, had by the Victorian era become something far more complicated. Clothing had transformed into a language, a system of visible signals that communicated class, morality, national pride, and personal tragedy, often all at once, in a single outfit worn while simply walking down the street to buy bread. To really understand what all of this meant for an actual woman living through it, not queens or fashion designers, but ordinary women waking up each morning and getting dressed for a long, hard day, we need to step away from these larger forces of power and step directly into daily life itself. We need to feel the weight of the fabric, smell the smoke-filled air of a Victorian city, and understand exactly what it took, physically and emotionally, to get dressed and face the world each morning during this remarkable, complicated era. Let's slow down now and step directly into a single morning. Not a special occasion, not a ball, not a funeral. Just an ordinary Tuesday, somewhere in England, sometime in the 1860s. Picture a woman waking up before dawn, because in Victorian England, dawn was often the only free light available before the day's labor began. If she was a servant, which a huge number of women were during this period, she might be waking in a small, cold room tucked under the roof of someone else's house, sharing a narrow bed with another servant simply to share warmth through the night. The room would have no fireplace of its own. Frost sometimes formed on the inside of the window glass during winter months. She would dress quickly in the dark, her fingers stiff from cold, working through layers of clothing by feel and habit rather than by sight. The layering itself deserves a slow walk through, because it tells us so much about what daily life actually demanded physically. First came the chemise, a simple, loose-fitting undergarment worn directly against the skin, usually made of linen or cotton, meant to protect the outer garments from body oils and sweat, since washing heavier garments was difficult and expensive. Over this came the drawers we mentioned earlier, and then stockings held up with simple garters tied above or below the knee. Then came the corset, or for working women, the simpler stays, laced snugly but rarely to the extreme tightness popular imagination suggests. Then petticoats, sometimes 2 or 3 layers depending on the season and the woman's class, followed finally by the dress itself. All of this every single morning before breakfast, before any actual work began. A servant might need to complete this entire process in under 10 minutes if she was running late, working purely by muscle memory built through years of repetition. Now think about breakfast itself, because food tells us just as much about daily reality as clothing does. For working-class women, breakfast was often simple and small. Bread, sometimes with a thin scraping of butter or dripping, which was the leftover fat saved from cooking meat, considered a valuable food item rather than something to throw away. Tea, sweetened if the family could afford sugar, which by this point in history had become widely available due to colonial trade, though still a real expense for poorer households. For wealthier women, breakfast might stretch into an elaborate affair. Eggs, cold meats, toast, marmalade, served in a dining room warmed by a fire that servants had already been up for hours tending. The smell of a Victorian morning is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it was nothing like the mostly odorless mornings many of us experience today. Coal, smoke hung thick in the air of most English cities and towns, since coal was the primary fuel for heating homes and powering the factories that had transformed the landscape. This smoke settled into fabric, into hair, into the very walls of buildings. A woman's dress, even freshly cleaned, likely carried a faint smoky smell within hours of being worn outside. Add to this the smell of horses, since horse-drawn transportation still dominated city streets, meaning manure and hay were constant background presences, along with the smell of unwashed bodies in crowded spaces, since regular bathing was far less common and far more difficult than it is today, requiring hauled and heated water rather than a simple turn of a tap. Illness moved through this world constantly, shaping daily decisions in ways that are hard for us to fully imagine now. A woman getting dressed in the morning was also making quiet calculations about her own body's vulnerability. Tuberculosis, often called consumption at the time, killed enormous numbers of people across all social classes, and its presence shaped even fashion choices as pale skin and a slender frame, symptoms sometimes associated with the disease's early stages, briefly became strangely fashionable, an unsettling detail that reveals how disease and beauty standards sometimes tangled together in uncomfortable ways. Class divisions showed up in almost every physical detail of daily life, often in ways too subtle to notice unless you know exactly where to look. A wealthy woman's hands remained soft and unmarked, her fingernails clean and shaped, because she did not spend her days scrubbing floors or washing laundry in harsh soap. A working woman's hands told an entirely different story, often red and cracked, sometimes permanently roughened by years of manual labor. Observers at the time, including many novelists of the era, noted that you could often tell a woman's social class simply by glancing at her hands, regardless of how nicely she might be dressed on a particular day. Family structure shaped daily life differently depending on class as well. In wealthier households, mothers often had limited direct daily contact with their own children, who were raised largely by nannies and governesses, seeing their parents formally for brief periods each day, sometimes just an hour before bedtime. In working-class households, the opposite was often true out of pure necessity. Mothers worked alongside their children in shared spaces, whether that meant a shared workshop, a shared field, or simply a cramped shared home, creating a closeness born not from parenting philosophy, but from economic reality. Weather shaped daily life with an intensity that modern heated and air-conditioned homes have made almost impossible to fully imagine now. English winters, damp and bone-chilling rather than dramatically cold, seeped into homes that were often poorly insulated by today's standards. A woman's clothing needed to serve as her primary defense against this constant dampness, which is part of why heavier wool fabrics remain popular despite their weight and difficulty to clean. Summer brought its own challenges, as heavy layered clothing designed partly for warmth became uncomfortable and sometimes genuinely dangerous during unusually hot stretches, contributing to the fainting episodes we mentioned earlier, episodes that were not always simply the result of tight corsets, but sometimes the very real physical strain of wearing multiple heavy layers during hot, poorly ventilated conditions. By midday, our imagined woman, whether servant, factory worker, or wife managing a household, would likely already feel the physical weight of her morning's labor pressing into her body. Fabric grown heavy with either cold dampness or midday sweat. Hands aching from repetitive tasks, whether that meant scrubbing, sewing, or simply managing the endless demands of running a household without modern conveniences we take for granted today. No running hot water, no electric lighting, no simple switch to flip for warmth or light. This is the texture of ordinary Victorian daily life that rarely makes it into films or paintings, because it is not dramatic in an obvious way. It is quiet, physical, repetitive, and deeply shaped by class in ways that determined almost everything, from the smell that clung to your clothes, to the texture of your hands, to how many layers you wore against a cold English morning, to whether breakfast meant a simple piece of bread or a full spread laid out by servants who had risen hours before you to prepare it. And within all of this daily physical reality, one particular object sat at the very center of how a woman experienced her own body throughout the day, an object so ordinary that most women never gave a second thought, yet so central to daily comfort and discomfort that it deserves its own careful, slow look. Let's look closely now at the corset itself. Not the exaggerated, cartoonish version popular culture loves to show us, but the real object, sitting quietly in museum collections today, waiting to tell its own surprisingly complicated story. A typical Victorian corset was constructed from multiple layers of sturdy fabric, usually cotton or linen, reinforced with channels sewn throughout to hold thin strips of whalebone, or later in the century, steel. These strips gave the garment its structure, allowing it to hold a shape rather than collapsing into soft fabric the moment a woman moved. Lacing ran up the back, sometimes assisted by another person, though many women, especially working women without servants to help them, learned to lace themselves using clever techniques, front lacing designs, or simply looping the laces in a way that allowed independent tightening. The whalebone itself tells its own quiet historical story worth pausing on for a moment. This material came from the baleen plates found in the mouths of certain whale species, used by the whales themselves to filter tiny food from ocean water. The Victorian demand for corsets, along with other structured garments and even umbrella ribs, fed directly into the massive commercial whaling industry of the era, connecting something as intimate and personal as a woman's undergarment to ships sailing dangerous Arctic and Atlantic waters, hunting enormous animals thousands of miles away from the London shop, where the finished corset would eventually be sold. Now here is where the real complexity of this object emerges, because historians who study original corsets preserved in museum collections have found something that challenges the popular imagination significantly. When you actually measure the waist sizes of surviving Victorian corsets, the vast majority fall within a range that, while smaller than a completely unrestricted natural waist, is nowhere near the impossibly tiny sizes often depicted in films and popular imagination. Most surviving corsets measure between 20 and 26 inches at the waist, which, while snug, represents a modest reduction for most women rather than the dramatic, almost impossible compression popular culture loves to exaggerate. The extreme tight lacing that produced genuinely tiny waist measurements did exist, but evidence suggests it was practiced by a much smaller number of women than commonly believed, mostly among a specific fashionable subculture, sometimes mocked even at the time by mainstream society and medical professionals. Newspapers and magazines from the era actually published numerous articles criticizing tight lacing as both unhealthy and somewhat vulgar, suggesting that respectable, sensible women were expected to wear their corsets comfortably rather than dangerously tight, directly contradicting the popular myth that all Victorian women were squeezed into breathless torture devices every single day. What the corset actually provided for most women was support rather than pure restriction. Remember that Victorian women, particularly those doing physical labor, needed back support during long hours of standing, bending, and lifting. The corset functioned somewhat like a modern back brace, distributing weight and providing structural support during physically demanding work. This practical function gets lost almost entirely in modern popular imagination, which tends to see the corset purely as a symbol of oppression rather than also considering its genuine, practical, physical usefulness in a world without modern ergonomic furniture or labor-saving devices. There is also a version of the corset specifically designed for pregnancy, which surprises most people who assume Victorian fashion had no accommodation at all for the pregnant body. These maternity corsets used adjustable lacing and additional panels that could expand gradually as pregnancy progressed, providing support for the lower back and abdomen during a physically demanding time, rather than attempting to hide or compress the pregnant belly, as some assume based on the era's general reputation for modesty and concealment. By the end of the Victorian era, moving into the early 20th century, the corset itself began to transform again, as new health movements and changing ideas about women's physical activity, including the growing popularity of cycling and other sports among women, created demand for less restrictive undergarments. This slow transformation eventually led toward the simpler, more flexible foundation garments that would replace the traditional corset entirely within just a few decades, showing how even an object as seemingly fixed and traditional as the Victorian corset was really just one stage in a much longer, continuously evolving relationship between women's bodies, fashion, and the practical demands of daily life. So this single object, when you really sit with it carefully, refuses to offer the simple story either side of the popular debate wants to tell. It was not purely a symbol of oppression, forced onto helpless women by a cruel patriarchal society. It was not purely a practical, harmless garment either, since genuine health complications from extreme tight lacing absolutely did occur among the subset of women who practiced it. The truth sits in a much more complicated middle space, a garment that provided real physical support for some women, created real physical harm for others, and carried enormous symbolic weight about class, respectability, and femininity for almost everyone who wore it, regardless of how tightly they actually laced the strings each morning. This complexity, this refusal to fit into a simple story, actually connects directly to something much larger happening throughout Victorian society during this exact same period, a deep and often uncomfortable divide in how different women experience their own bodies, their own clothing, and their own daily lives, depending entirely on which side of the era's rigid social hierarchy they happen to be born into. Let's place two women side by side for a moment, both waking up on the exact same Tuesday morning we described earlier, both getting dressed within just a few miles of each other in the same English city, yet living in what might as well have been two entirely different worlds. The first woman is the wife of a wealthy merchant, perhaps a man who made his fortune through the textile trade we discussed earlier. She wakes in a warm room, a fire already lit by a servant before dawn. She does not dress herself. A lady's maid arrives to help her into her layers, carefully lacing her corset, arranging her petticoats, fastening the small buttons running down the back of her dress that would be nearly impossible to reach alone. This process might take 30 minutes or more, not because dressing is inherently difficult, but because her clothing has been designed, quite intentionally, to require assistance, itself a subtle but powerful signal of wealth and status. A woman who needs help getting dressed is a woman who can afford to employ someone else's labor. The second woman is a servant working in a household not unlike this one, or perhaps a factory worker preparing for a long shift. She dresses herself, quickly, in the dark, in simpler clothing designed for movement and durability rather than display. Her corset, if she wears one at all, is looser, more practical, meant to support her body through hours of physical labor rather than to create an impressive silhouette for social display. Her dress is likely made of sturdier, cheaper fabric, in a color chosen for its ability to hide dirt and wear rather than for fashionable beauty. These two women might pass each other on the street later that same morning, and to a casual observer, both would simply look like Victorian women in long dresses. But the differences embedded in their clothing, how it was made, how it was put on, what it was designed to communicate, reveal an enormous social gulf that fashion historians have spent decades carefully documenting. This divide extended deeply into rural versus urban experience as well. A woman living in the countryside, working on a farm or in a small village, often maintained clothing styles and habits that lagged years, sometimes decades, behind the rapidly shifting fashions of London and other major cities. Fashion magazines took time to circulate to rural areas, and even when new styles became known, rural women often lacked access to the fabrics, dyes, and tailoring services available in urban centers. A rural woman's dress might reflect fashion trends from 10 years earlier, not out of ignorance, but simply because rural economic and social life moved at a fundamentally different pace than the fast-changing urban fashion world we tend to focus on when discussing this era. The divide between clergy-influenced modesty and everyday practical reality created its own fascinating tension too. Religious teaching throughout the period emphasized modest, controlled dress as a moral virtue, yet actual practical necessity often pushed against these ideals in ways rarely discussed openly. Working women frequently needed to hitch up their skirts while doing physical labor, exposing more of their legs and ankles than strict modesty codes technically allowed. This was simply accepted as practical necessity in working contexts, even while the same exposed ankle might be considered scandalous in a formal social setting. Society essentially operated with two sets of rules running simultaneously, one for public display and formal occasions, another quieter, more forgiving set of rules for the practical realities of actual daily labor. Perhaps the starkest divide of all existed between adult women and female children during this era, a divide that shaped clothing in ways that revealed deep assumptions about growing up and gender roles. Young girls were typically dressed in simpler, shorter, more practical clothing that allowed for physical play and movement, clothing not dramatically different in basic structure from what young boys wore during early childhood. The transition into full adult women's clothing, including the first corset, the first full-length skirt, typically happened around the age we would now consider early adolescence, and this transition was often treated as a significant, sometimes celebrated milestone, marking a young girl's formal entrance into womanhood and all the social expectations, restrictions, and responsibilities that came along with it. This moment, a young girl receiving her first proper corset and full-length dress, deserves us pausing on it a bit longer because it represents something profound about how deeply clothing itself functioned as a marker of social transformation during this era. It was not simply a change in what she wore. It represented a change in how she was expected to move through the world, how much physical freedom she would now be permitted, what kind of behavior would now be considered appropriate for her age and gender. Many women later in life, writing memoirs or letters reflecting back on this transition, described a complicated mixture of pride and loss, pride at being treated as a young woman rather than a child, but also a genuine physical loss of the freedom of movement they had enjoyed in simpler childhood clothing. Men and women's experience of clothing itself also reveals an enormous, often overlooked divide worth sitting with briefly here. While Victorian men's fashion certainly had its own rules and restrictions, formal suits, high collars, specific expectations around hats and gloves, the sheer physical burden of Victorian fashion fell overwhelmingly onto women's bodies. Men's clothing, even at its most formal, rarely restricted movement, breathing, or physical comfort to nearly the same degree that women's fashion regularly did. This asymmetry, largely unquestioned at the time, reveals something important about whose comfort and whose display value society considered more important during this particular period of history. When you step back and look at all of these divides together, wealthy versus working, urban versus rural, religious ideal versus practical necessity, childhood versus adulthood, male versus female, a much richer, more complicated picture of Victorian society begins to emerge than the simple image of the proper Victorian woman we started with at the very beginning of tonight's journey. There was never really one single Victorian female experience. There were many overlapping, sometimes contradictory experiences shaped by class, geography, age, and circumstance, all existing simultaneously within the same few decades, under the same queen, within the same small island nation. And understanding this complexity brings us directly towards something even more surprising, a specific belief many of us carry about Victorian women's lives that turns out, upon closer historical examination, to be one of the biggest misunderstandings of the entire era, a correction that might genuinely change how you picture this period for the rest of your life. Here is the belief most of us carry, quietly, without ever really questioning it. We assume that Victorian fashion, all of it, the tight corsets, the heavy skirts, the endless layers, was something imposed upon women by men. A patriarchal system, we imagine, deciding what women should wear, then forcing them into compliance, while women themselves suffered quietly, wishing they could dress differently if only they had the freedom to choose. This belief feels intuitive. It fits neatly into a larger story we already understand about power and gender during this era. And there is real truth tucked inside it, since Victorian society absolutely was structured in ways that limited women's legal rights, political voice, and economic independence far more than men's. But when historians look closely at who actually designed, promoted, sold, and enforced Victorian fashion trends, a much more complicated and honestly more interesting picture emerges. This is where I need to pause and tell you clearly, because scholars still debate exactly how much agency individual women felt they had, that the evidence we do have points towards something the simple story leaves out entirely. Women were overwhelmingly the ones running this system, not just wearing it. The fashion magazines that dictated what was stylish, publications like the English Woman's Domestic magazine we mentioned earlier, were largely written, edited, and read entirely within female social circles. Men rarely involved themselves in the granular details of women's fashion at all, considering it beneath their attention or simply outside their area of interest. The pressure to follow trends, to lace a corset a certain way, to wear the correct mourning fabric for the correct number of months, to achieve the fashionable silhouette of a given year, came predominantly from other women. Mothers pressured daughters. Sisters compared themselves to sisters. Social circles of women policed each other's clothing choices with a level of scrutiny that had little direct male involvement at all. Dressmakers, the skilled professionals who actually constructed these elaborate garments, were also, for the vast majority, women. This was one of the few respectable professions genuinely open to women during this era, and successful female dressmakers could achieve real financial independence and social standing through their craft. These were the women designing the corsets, calculating the crinoline dimensions, choosing which arsenic lace green fabric to recommend to a client. The system of Victorian fashion was, in a very real structural sense, a female economy, built and maintained by women, for women, even while operating within a larger society that limited women's rights in almost every other significant area of life. This does not mean no coercion existed. Social pressure is still pressure, even when it comes from other women rather than men directly. A young woman who refused to wear a corset, who declined to follow current fashion, who dressed too plainly or too eccentrically, faced real social consequences. Gossip, exclusion, damaged marriage prospects, often enforced primarily by other women in her community rather than by fathers or husbands directly instructing her wardrobe. Some historians studying original letters and diaries from the period have found something else worth sitting with quietly here too. Many women actually described enjoying their fashionable clothing, taking genuine pride and pleasure in a beautifully constructed dress, in the ritual of getting ready, in the social performance of appearing fashionable among friends. The popular modern assumption that Victorian fashion was purely oppressive something women endured rather than participated in with any genuine enthusiasm, flattens out a much richer emotional reality that existing letters and diaries reveal. There is genuine scholarly disagreement about how to weigh all of this. Some historians emphasize the very real physical harm certain extreme fashion practices caused, and argue that even genuine enjoyment does not erase the underlying systemic pressures that made such harmful fashions feel necessary in the first place. Other historians push back against what they see as an overly simple narrative of pure victimhood, arguing that Victorian women exercised more genuine creative agency and personal pleasure within fashion than modern audiences tend to assume, projecting our own contemporary assumptions about oppression backward onto women who may have experienced their own choices quite differently. I think both sides of this debate are pointing at something true, and the honest answer probably sits somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Victorian women were not simply helpless victims of male-controlled fashion, since the system was overwhelmingly built and enforced by women themselves. But they also were not making entirely free choices in some neutral vacuum, since the social and economic pressures shaping what counted as acceptable femininity were very real, even when the direct enforcers of those pressures were mothers, sisters, and friends rather than fathers and husbands. This reframing matters quietly because it changes something important about how we understand history itself. It is tempting to sort the past in simple categories: victims and oppressors, oppressed women and controlling men. But real history, the kind that sits in old letters and dressmakers' account books rather than simplified summaries, almost always resists these clean categories. Victorian women were simultaneously constrained by their era and active participants in shaping its culture, sometimes even actively participating in constraining each other in ways that are far more complicated and honestly far more human than the simple story most of us inherited without ever examining it closely. Understanding this complexity prepares us for something else worth exploring now: the deeply repetitive, ritualized nature of how Victorian women actually organized their days, weeks, and years around clothing, a rhythm of habits and ceremonies that shaped daily life with a kind of quiet, steady regularity that modern life, with its constant unpredictable change, rarely offers anymore. There's a particular rhythm to how a Victorian woman's year unfolded, season by season, occasion by occasion, and once you understand this rhythm, you start to see her entire wardrobe less as a collection of separate items, and more as a kind of calendar worn directly on the body, marking time in ways we have almost entirely lost today. Consider the simple, repeated ritual of dressing for church on Sunday. For most Victorian women, regardless of class, Sunday represented the one day of the week set aside for rest and worship, and clothing marked this distinction clearly. A woman's Sunday best, often her finest and most carefully maintained garment, was worn specifically and only for this weekly occasion, then carefully removed, brushed, and stored away again until the following week. This repeated weekly ritual, 6 days of practical working clothes followed by 1 day of careful, deliberate presentation, created a steady rhythm that structured time itself, a physical reminder, worn on the body, that one day differed fundamentally from the other 6. The seasons themselves carried their own clothing rituals, shifting gradually rather than suddenly, following patterns passed down through generations of practical accumulated wisdom about English weather. As autumn approached, heavier wool fabrics would gradually replace lighter cotton and linen. Certain colors associated with autumn and winter, deep burgundies, dark greens, rich browns, would emerge from storage, while the lighter pastels and whites of summer were carefully packed away, sometimes wrapped in paper to protect them from moths during their months of rest. This slow, seasonal rotation of the wardrobe was not simply practical. It carried an almost meditative quality, a repeated yearly ceremony that connected a woman's body directly to the turning of the natural world outside her window. Mourning rituals followed perhaps the most elaborate and precisely structured pattern of all, and it is worth walking through slowly because the level of detail involved reveals just how deeply Victorian society believed in the power of repeated, structured ritual to process grief. Full mourning, the first and most intense stage following a death, typically required a woman to wear only black in fabrics like crepe that were deliberately dull and light, absorbing rather than shiny, for a period that could last a full year for a widow mourning her husband. This would gradually shift into what was called half mourning, where small amounts of muted color, gray, lavender, soft mauve, could slowly be reintroduced into the wardrobe, signaling to the entire community that a woman's grief, while still present, had begun its slow transition back toward ordinary life. This staged, ritualized approach to grief, marked visibly through clothing, meant that an entire community could read a woman's emotional state simply by observing what she wore on any given day. There was something almost hypnotic about this system, a slow, predictable unwinding of color and fabric that mirrored the slow, unpredictable unwinding of grief itself, giving structure and shape to an experience that otherwise feels formless and overwhelming. The ritual of a young woman's formal entrance into society, sometimes called coming out, carried its own specific, repeated ceremonial weight as well. This typically involved a young woman of appropriate age and social class being formally presented, often at a specific event like a ball or court presentation, wearing a carefully chosen white gown symbolizing purity and readiness for courtship and eventual marriage. This single ceremonial moment, repeated across countless families year after year with only small variations, marked a transition every bit as significant and ritualized as a wedding itself, announcing to an entire social circle that a young woman had officially entered the marriage market, ready to be considered as a potential wife. Even the daily ritual of dressing itself, repeated every single morning without exception, carried a kind of quiet ceremony to it, particularly for wealthier women who dressed with the assistance of a lady's maid. This daily process, the careful lacing, the precise arrangement of petticoats, the final adjustment of hair and accessories, often unfolded in nearly identical sequence day after day, year after year, creating a deeply embodied rhythm that a woman's hands and body would have known almost without conscious thought, the way you might know the exact number of steps leading up to your own front door without ever needing to count them. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, a kind of comfort hidden inside all this repetition that we rarely acknowledge in modern life, obsessed as we often are with constant change and novelty. These repeated rituals, seasonal, weekly, daily, gave Victorian women's lives a predictable structure and rhythm that, however restrictive it may have felt in other ways, also provided something steady and reliable to hold on to, a sense that even amid the uncertainties of illness, financial struggle, or loss, certain things would repeat, certain patterns would continue, certain rhythms of dressing and undressing, of seasons turning, of mornings slowly softening into ordinary life again, would carry a woman forward through even her most difficult years. This same body, moving through these same careful rituals day after day, season after season, was also constantly negotiating something far more vulnerable and immediate, the simple, ever-present reality of physical survival in a world without modern medicine, modern safety standards, or modern understanding of the dangers hidden inside fashionable clothing itself. Let's talk honestly, gently about what it actually meant to inhabit a woman's body during this era. Because underneath all the fabric and ritual we have discussed tonight, there was a very real, very physical experience of survival happening every single day. Childbirth stood as perhaps the single most dangerous physical event a Victorian woman was likely to face in her entire lifetime. Medical understanding of infection, still decades away from fully grasping the importance of basic hygiene practices we now consider obvious, meant that childbirth carried genuine, significant risk of death for both mother and child. Clothing played a quiet but real role here too. Pregnant women continued wearing structured garments, adapted maternity corsets as we mentioned earlier, well into their pregnancies, and the practical challenge of managing multiple heavy layers of fabric during labor itself, in an era before hospital births were common, when most women delivered at home, added a layer of physical difficulty to an already dangerous and painful process. Disease moved through Victorian society with a persistence that shaped daily fear in ways modern medicine has made difficult for us to fully imagine now. We mentioned tuberculosis earlier, but cholera outbreaks, particularly in crowded urban areas with inadequate clean water access, could sweep through entire neighborhoods within days, taking healthy adults and children alike with a suddenness that must have felt terrifying and impossible to predict. A woman getting dressed on an ordinary morning was doing so within a world where sudden, unexplained death was a much closer, much more familiar presence than it is for most of us today. Aging itself carried different meaning and different physical reality during this era as well. Without modern dental care, many women experience significant tooth loss by middle age, affecting both appearance and the ability to eat certain foods comfortably. Without modern skincare or reliable sun protection, skin aged more visibly and more quickly, particularly for working women who spent significant time outdoors regardless of weather. The fashionable pale complexion we discussed earlier connected partly to this reality too, since pale, unweathered skin visibly signaled that a woman did not need to labor outdoors, connecting beauty standards once again directly back to class and the physical marks that different kinds of work left on the body over time. The dangers hidden inside fashionable clothing itself deserve one more honest, careful look here, beyond just the arsenic dye we discussed at the very beginning of tonight's journey. The wide crinoline skirts we described earlier, while solving the practical problem of heavy petticoats, introduced a new and genuinely serious danger: fire. Open flames were everywhere in Victorian daily life: candles, gas lamps, open hearths used for cooking and heating. The wide, flowing fabric of a crinoline skirt could catch fire with frightening ease if a woman moved too close to an open flame. And because the steel cage structure held the fabric away from the body, flames could spread rapidly across the skirt before a woman even realized what was happening. Newspaper records from the era document numerous tragic deaths from crinoline-related fires, serious enough that this became a genuine, widely discussed safety concern of the time, prompting some safety-conscious women to avoid the most extreme, wide-skirted versions of the style, specifically because of this fire risk. Labor fatigue affected women's bodies in ways that varied enormously by class, as we have discussed. But even wealthy women, freed from physical labor, often experienced their own particular form of physical strain, the fatigue that came from spending enormous portions of each day standing or sitting in restrictive clothing during long social calls, formal dinners, and extended social obligations that structured upper-class daily life. The body pays a price for restriction just as surely as it pays a price for hard labor. Simply a different kind of price, showing up as different kinds of exhaustion, different kinds of chronic discomfort. Environmental exposure shaped survival in ways connected directly back to the coal smoke-filled air we described earlier in a typical Victorian morning. Respiratory illness, worsened by constant exposure to coal smoke and poor ventilation in both homes and workplaces, affected women across all classes, though working women in factories, exposed to industrial pollutants and dust for hours at a time, faced particularly serious long-term respiratory health risks that were barely understood or addressed by the medical and legal systems of the time. What emerges from all of this, when we sit with it honestly rather than looking away from discomfort, is a picture of daily survival that required constant, quiet negotiation between fashion, practicality, and genuine physical risk. A Victorian woman getting dressed each morning was not simply choosing an outfit. She was making small, largely unconscious calculations about warmth, modesty, social expectation, and yes, sometimes genuine physical danger, whether from a poisonous green dye, a fire-prone crinoline, or the sheer physical strain of maintaining a fashionable appearance through long hours of daily labor or social obligation. This is not meant to frighten you tonight. Lying there in your warm, safe bed, far removed from coal smoke and open flame and the quiet, everyday risks these women faced without a second thought. Because for them, this was simply what an ordinary life looked like. It is meant instead to help you feel, just for a moment, the real physical weight and vulnerability underneath all the beautiful fabric and elaborate ritual we have spent tonight exploring together. A reminder that history is never really about symbols and fashion trends in the abstract. It is always, underneath everything else, about real bodies, breathing real air, facing real risks, simply trying to move through each ordinary day as safely and as gracefully as circumstances allowed. And having sat with this vulnerability for a moment, we can now step back out into the wider world and watch how the larger forces of industrialization, science, and gradually shifting social attitudes slowly began to reshape and soften some of these very real dangers, changing what it meant to be a woman getting dressed in England decade by decade as the 19th century moved steadily towards close. Let your breath slow a little more now, because we are about to watch the world shift beneath Victorian women's feet, slowly at first, then faster, as forces far beyond any individual woman's control began reshaping daily life in ways both liberating and unsettling all at once. The invention of the sewing machine, patented in its practical, commercially viable form in the 1850s by Isaac Singer, deserves real attention here, because this single mechanical device transformed clothing production more dramatically than almost any other technological advancement of the entire era. Before the sewing machine, every single stitch in every single garment was sewn by hand, either by the woman who wore it or by a professional seamstress whose labor represented a significant expense for wealthier clients. A single elaborate dress could require dozens of hours of painstaking handwork, making truly fashionable clothing accessible only to those with significant time or significant money. The sewing machine changed this calculation entirely. Suddenly, garments that would have taken days to construct by hand could be completed in hours. The price of finished clothing dropped dramatically as production accelerated, making fashionable dress accessible to a much wider segment of the population than ever before. A working-class woman in the 1870s could afford garments that would have been completely beyond her reach just 2 decades earlier, not because her wages had increased significantly, but because the labor cost embedded in clothing itself had collapsed thanks to mechanical production. But this same technological shift that made fashion more accessible also created new forms of exploitation and suffering among the women who worked in the rapidly growing garment industry. Sweatshops, small cramped workrooms where women operated sewing machines for punishingly long hours under dangerous conditions and desperately low pay, emerged as a dark shadow alongside the bright promise of cheaper, more accessible clothing. A woman buying a fashionable dress for less money than ever before rarely thought about, and often had no way of knowing the conditions endured by the woman who had stitched it together in a crowded, poorly ventilated room somewhere across the city. The spread of the British Empire itself continued reshaping fashion in new ways as the century progressed, introducing fabrics, patterns, and styles borrowed, and often directly stolen from colonized regions. Indian cotton, Egyptian cotton, patterns appropriated from various colonized cultures without credit or compensation, all circulated through London fashion markets, transforming what British women wore while erasing the actual origins and cultural meanings of the designs they casually adopted. A shawl pattern that carried deep spiritual or regional meaning in its original context became, in British hands, simply a pretty design disconnected entirely from its history, bought and sold as if it had always belonged to English fashion rather than being extracted, like so many other resources, from lands under British imperial control. Scientific understanding began shifting too, slowly challenging some of the most dangerous fashion practices we have discussed tonight. By the 1870s and 80s, medical professionals and public health advocates were publishing increasingly vocal criticisms of tight lacing, of arsenic-based dyes, of the physical dangers posed by heavy, restrictive clothing. These criticisms did not immediately change fashion. Social pressure and aesthetic ideals moved far more slowly than scientific understanding, but they did begin creating small cracks in the certainty that had previously surrounded these practices, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually, over the coming decades, transform women's fashion entirely. Legal reforms, while painfully slow, also began gradually shifting the position of women in British society in ways that indirectly affected clothing and fashion. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed in stages throughout the later Victorian period, slowly gave married women legal rights to own property and control their own earnings, rather than automatically transferring all ownership to their husbands upon marriage. This shift, while limited compared to what would come later, gave some women, particularly middle-class women, slightly more economic independence and slightly more ability to make autonomous decisions about their own lives, including what they chose to spend money on, which absolutely included clothing and fashion. But here is something worth considering quietly as you sink deeper into your pillow. Even as the world transformed around them, Victorian fashion left something behind that persists even now, long after the corsets and crinolines disappeared entirely, a cultural memory, or perhaps more accurately, a cultural misremembering that still shapes how we imagine the past today. Close your eyes completely now if you have not already, and picture a Victorian woman one more time. But this time, notice where that image actually comes from. Not from history itself, but from movies you have watched, television shows you have seen, Halloween costumes hanging in discount stores every October, the entire modern machinery of popular culture that has taken Victorian fashion and remade it into something else entirely, something that serves our needs rather than reflecting their reality. The tight-laced, fainting, helpless Victorian woman appears again and again in film and television. Not because this accurately represents most women's historical experience, but because she serves a narrative purpose for modern storytelling. She gives us a clear before image to contrast against modern freedom. She becomes a symbol of how far women's liberation has come, even when that symbol flattens and distorts the actual complicated reality we have spent tonight slowly unwrapping together. Films set in the Victorian era, particularly romantic period dramas, love to show elaborate balls and beautiful gowns, creating a visual spectacle that audiences enjoy watching, but that represents only the tiniest, wealthiest fraction of Victorian society. Even school history textbooks, which you might expect to offer more reliable information, often repeat simplified versions of Victorian women's history that leave out the complexity we have explored tonight. The textbook version tends to present Victorian women as purely victims of oppressive fashion, rarely acknowledging the ways women themselves participated in creating and enforcing fashion rules, or the genuine pleasure and creativity many women found within the system despite its restrictions. There's something almost ironic here worth sitting with quietly. The real Victorian era, messy and complicated as it was, has been replaced in popular imagination with a much simpler, cleaner version that serves our modern needs better than actual history does. We want the Victorians to be repressed so we can feel liberated by comparison. We want their fashion to be torturous so our fashion feels comfortable and free. We want their women to be helpless so our women feel empowered. And popular culture, always happy to give audiences what they want rather than what actually happened, delivers this simplified version again and again until it becomes the truth most people believe, far more widely believed than the complicated, ambiguous reality historians actually find when they examine original sources carefully. This does not make popular culture evil or intentionally dishonest, exactly. It is simply doing what popular culture has always done, taking raw historical material and reshaping it into stories that entertain, inspire, or teach lessons that current audiences find meaningful. But the consequence, the quiet cost of this process, is that the real Victorian women, the ones who actually lived through this era in all its genuine complexity, slowly disappear behind the simplified costume drama version, remembered less and less accurately as time passes and popular retellings multiply. And yet, something did survive. Not the corsets themselves, though some still exist in museum collections. Not the arsenic dresses, mostly gone now. Not even the specific fashion rules that once seemed so permanent and important. What survived is something stranger and perhaps more interesting than any of these physical objects. Certain ideas, certain habits, certain assumptions embedded deep in Victorian fashion persisted forward through time in ways we barely notice today because they have become so thoroughly naturalized into our own modern world. Let your mind drift a little now, following a quieter question. Out of all the specific strange things Victorian women wore, almost nothing carried forward unchanged into the modern world. The crinoline disappeared. The corset transformed into something entirely different. The elaborate mourning rules faded away. And yet something underneath all of this, some deeper pattern, some foundational idea, did survive, often in forms so subtle we walk past them every day without recognizing their Victorian origins at all. The basic idea that women's clothing should be more elaborate, more decorative, more expensive, and more time-consuming than men's, clothing absolutely persisted forward from the Victorian era into modern fashion, even though the specific forms changed entirely. Walk through any department store today and notice which section offers more variety, more color, more different styles, and seasonal changes. It is still, overwhelmingly, the women's section carrying forward a Victorian assumption so deeply embedded we rarely even question it, that women's appearance requires more attention, more expense, more constant updating than men's. The wedding dress itself, specifically the white wedding dress, survived as perhaps the single most visible Victorian fashion legacy still actively practiced today. White wedding dresses existed before Queen Victoria, but when she chose to wear white at her own wedding in 1840, departing from the previous royal tradition of wearing elaborate colored gowns, she set a trend that spread outward from that single event across the entire Western world, persisting now for well over a century and a half, so thoroughly naturalized that most brides today have no idea they're following a fashion choice Queen Victoria made nearly 200 years ago. The concept of fashion itself as something that changes seasonally, that requires constant updating and replacement, even when existing clothing remains perfectly functional, survived and actually intensified as Victorian fashion transformed into modern fashion. The Victorians did not invent this idea. Fashion had changed across earlier centuries too, but the specific pace of change, the expectation that each new season requires new purchases to remain fashionable, accelerated dramatically during the Victorian era thanks to mass production and advertising, then carried forward into the 20th and 21st centuries in even more extreme forms, creating the fast fashion industry we know today, where clothing is sometimes designed to be worn only a handful of times before being discarded and replaced. Certain Victorian anxieties about the female body, particularly the idea that the natural female body requires structured intervention to achieve an acceptable shape, survived too, simply transforming from corsets into different technologies. Shapewear, a modern billion-dollar industry, sells products designed to compress, smooth, and reshape women's bodies under their clothing using essentially the same basic logic that drove Victorian corset wearing. The assumption that the natural body, left unmodified, is somehow insufficiently acceptable for public display. The specific technology changed from whalebone and laces to elastic and synthetic fabrics, but the underlying idea that women's bodies require this kind of intervention in ways men's bodies generally do not, carried forward largely unchanged beneath the surface. The language of modesty, particularly the idea that women's bodies are inherently more sexual and therefore require more careful management and covering than men's bodies, survived from Victorian culture into modern dress codes, school policies, workplace regulations, often barely modified from their Victorian origins. When a school dress code today tells a teenage girl her shoulders are distracting, it is echoing a Victorian assumption about female bodies and male self-control that would be very familiar to a woman living in 1870. The specific body part being regulated changed from ankles to shoulders, but the basic logic underneath remained remarkably consistent. What allowed these particular ideas to survive while so many other Victorian fashion specifics disappeared entirely? The answer sits in something historians call cultural flexibility. The ideas that survived were the ones adaptable enough to take new forms as the world changed around them. The corset itself, a specific rigid object, could not adapt to 20th century ideas about women's physical activity and health, so it disappeared. But the idea underneath the corset that women's bodies require technological intervention to achieve beauty was flexible enough to transform into entirely new products, from girdles to push-up bras to modern shapewear, allowing the core concept to survive even as the specific technology changed completely. These ideas also survived because they remained economically useful. The expectation that women need to constantly update their wardrobes, that women's appearance requires more products and more intervention than men's, directly serves the fashion and beauty industries that profit from selling endless solutions to problems they often help create in the first place. There is powerful economic incentive to keep these ideas alive, evolving them just enough to feel modern while preserving the profitable core assumption that women's appearance requires constant attention, constant expense, constant intervention. And perhaps most powerfully, these ideas survived because they became identity. For many women across generations, the ritual of getting dressed, of choosing clothing, of participating in fashion became genuinely woven into how they understood themselves and expressed creativity, personality, and social belonging. This was true for Victorian women, as we discussed earlier, and remains true for many women today. When a practice becomes identity rather than just obligation, it carries forward through generations even when the original reasons for it have long since faded away. Because people protect and preserve the practices that help them feel like themselves, regardless of where those practices originally came from. So Victorian fashion survived, not as museum pieces, though those exist too, but as ideas, assumptions, and practices so thoroughly absorbed in a modern culture that we stopped seeing them as Victorian at all. They simply became the water we swim in, invisible until someone points them out and asks the uncomfortable question of where they actually came from and whether they still serve us today, or whether we have simply been carrying them forward out of habit, unexamined inheritances from an era that ended more than a century ago. What does all of this reveal when you step back and look at the whole strange story we have walked through together tonight? About humans ourselves, about why we wear what we wear, about what fashion actually is underneath all the fabric and trend and social pressure. Let yourself float now, away from specific corsets and specific dresses and specific Victorian women, and toward something larger and quieter that sits underneath this entire story, something true about humans in general, across all times and all places, that Victorian fashion simply revealed with particular clarity. Here is what I think we see when we really look closely at everything we have walked through tonight. Humans are animals who cannot stop creating meaning, even in the most ordinary, practical parts of daily life. We cannot simply wear clothing for warmth and protection. We cannot help but load even the simplest garment with layers of social signal, personal identity, group belonging, status display, and symbolic meaning that goes far beyond the object's basic practical function. A Victorian woman putting on a corset was never just putting on an undergarment. She was putting on respectability, putting on class identity, putting on femininity as her culture defined it, putting on belonging, putting on morality, putting on everything her society believed about what a proper woman should be, all compressed into a single piece of shape fabric and whalebone. This is not unique to Victorians. We do exactly the same thing today, simply with different objects carrying different meanings. The specific symbols change across time and culture, but the human need to make symbols out of everything we touch appears to be universal, persistent, perhaps even unavoidable. This also reveals something about control and the deeply human need to feel like we have some influence over a world that mostly feels beyond our control. Victorian women could not control whether they would survive childbirth. They could not control whether disease would take their children. They could not control the economic pressures that determined whether their families would eat or go hungry. But they could control, at least partly, how they looked, what they wore, whether they followed fashion rules correctly. Clothing became one of the few areas of life where careful attention and effort seemed to produce predictable results, offering a small sphere of manageable control in a life otherwise full of terrifying uncertainties. We still do this today. We obsess over appearance, over fashion, over looking right, often far out of proportion to its actual importance. Partly because it feels like something we can influence and manage in a world where most of the truly important things, health, safety, whether the people we love will stay alive, remain largely beyond our individual control. Fashion gives us the comforting illusion of control, a problem we can solve by simply buying the right thing, following the right rules, trying hard enough. There's also something here about continuity and the deeply human need to feel connected to something larger than our individual lives. The mourning jewelry we discussed, hair from a dead, loved one worn daily against the skin, reveals a powerful human hunger to maintain physical connection to people we have lost, to hold onto some tangible piece of them, even after death makes direct connection impossible. We need objects to carry memory. We need rituals to structure grief. We need visible, physical ways to demonstrate that loss matters, that the dead are not simply forgotten the moment they disappear from sight. This too persists in modern culture, though in different forms. We keep photographs of dead, loved ones on our phones. We wear wedding rings decades after a spouse has died. We preserve clothing or objects that belong to people we loved, sometimes for years, decades, the rest of our lives, because the object carries the person's presence in ways that pure memory somehow does not. The specific object changed from a lock of hair to a saved voicemail message, but the underlying need, the human hunger to hold onto the dead through physical objects, remained exactly the same. Victorian fashion also reveals something about performance and the exhausting human reality that we are almost always performing some version of ourselves for an audience, rarely simply existing privately without concern for how we appear to others. The elaborate ritual of getting dressed for Victorian women was preparation for a performance, constructing the public self that would walk through the world being observed, judged, and interpreted by everyone who saw her. This performance was exhausting then, and remains exhausting now, because the private self and the performed public self are never quite the same, and maintaining the gap between them requires constant energy and attention. And perhaps most fundamentally, this entire story reveals something about belonging and the powerful human need to signal group membership visibly, to mark ourselves as part of something larger than our individual isolated existence. Victorian women who followed fashion rules were not just pursuing beauty. They were pursuing visible proof that they belonged, that they fit, that they were not alone. Fashion became a language of belonging, and choosing not to speak that language, choosing to dress differently, To ignore fashion rules meant risking the very real pain of social exclusion, of being marked as outside, as other, as not belonging to the group. We still use clothing this way today, as a visual language of group membership, from school uniforms to professional dress codes to subculture fashion that signals belonging to specific communities: punk, goth, preppy, streetwear, each one a visible declaration of identity and belonging worn on the body for anyone observant enough to read it. The specific styles change constantly, but the underlying human need driving all of it, the need to belong, to be recognized, and yet their standards changed. Everything they believed was permanent and important eventually transformed into something else, something they could not have predicted or even imagined. The corset that seemed essential to respectability slowly loosened, then disappeared entirely, replaced by entirely different garments, serving entirely different purposes. The mourning rules that structured years of women's lives gradually softened until they barely existed at all, until a woman could grieve in private without the entire community watching the color of her dress to measure the depth of her loss. This means, if you follow the thought slowly to its quiet conclusion, that our own standards, the ones that feel so permanent and important right now, will also change, are probably already changing in ways we cannot quite see yet, will eventually transform into something our great-grandchildren will look back on with the same gentle confusion and curiosity we have brought to Victorian corsets and arsenic green dresses tonight. There's something freeing in that thought, something that allows you to hold your own daily anxieties a little more lightly, knowing they're temporary, knowing the rules you follow so carefully today will eventually soften and transform just as surely as the Victorian rules did, returning to dust and memory and quiet museum exhibits that future people will walk through, shaking their heads gently at the strange things we wore, the strange things we believed, the strange things that once felt absolutely essential to being a proper, acceptable person in the world. Breathe slowly now. Feel the weight of your own body against the mattress. No corset required, no petticoats, no layers upon layers of heavy fabric. Just you in comfortable modern clothing, or perhaps no clothing at all, just skin against soft sheets, warm and safe and free to breathe as deeply as you want without restriction. The seasons still turn, just as they did for Victorian women watching autumn arrive and winter deepen and spring finally return. But we mark them differently now, without the elaborate seasonal wardrobe rotations, without the same careful attention to which colors belong to which months. We mark them in other ways, quieter ways perhaps, ways future people will also look back on someday, with curiosity about what we considered normal, what we thought mattered, what we could not imagine living without. Memory works strangely with sleep. The details fade first, the specific dates and names and measurements, while the larger patterns, the human truths underneath everything, tend to settle deeper, finding a home somewhere in your mind where they will rest quietly, surfacing occasionally in unexpected moments. When you see an old photograph or visit a museum or simply wonder, for no particular reason, what daily life felt like in an era so close to ours in some ways, yet so impossibly distant in others. Let the Victorian women rest now. Let them return to their own time, no longer needing your attention or concern. They lived their lives, made their choices within the options available to them, found moments of beauty and joy and creativity even within systems that restricted them, endured losses we can barely imagine, survived in ways both heroic and simply ordinary, day after ordinary day, morning after morning, getting dressed in the dark, moving through their hours, returning to bed each night, just as you are returning to bed now, seeking the same rest, the same peace, the same temporary release from the demands and expectations of being alive and visible in the world. Your own breathing has probably slowed without you noticing. Your thoughts are probably already starting to drift in that particular way that happens as sleep approaches, where one idea flows into another without logical connection, where images float past without needing to be examined or understood, where the boundary between awake and asleep grows soft and permeable, easy to slip across without even realizing the moment of transition. This is exactly where you should be right now. Not holding on to facts, not trying to remember everything, just floating peacefully in the quiet space between waking knowledge and sleeping rest, letting the story we walked through together settle wherever it needs to settle, trusting that the pieces worth keeping will stay with you while the rest dissolves harmlessly away, like morning fog burning off under gentle sun. The women are sleeping too, all of them, the queens and servants and seamstresses and mothers and daughters, sleeping the long sleep that eventually comes for everyone, released from corsets and mourning rules and social expectations, and the endless daily work of being human in a body that must be fed and clothed and presented to the world day after day after day. Let yourself join them in that rest now. Not permanently, of course, just for tonight, just for these quiet hours of darkness when consciousness can finally release its grip and allow you to drift free, weightless, unburdened by the need to signal or perform or belong, just existing peacefully in the safe darkness behind your closed eyes. One more slow breath. Feel it fill your lungs completely. Then release, carrying with it any remaining tension, any lingering thoughts that no longer serve you tonight, leaving only the gentle weight of your body and the soft rhythm of your breathing and the knowledge that you are safe, you are comfortable, you are exactly where you need to be. The story is almost finished now. Just one more small piece, one final image to carry you gently across the threshold into sleep, a last quiet thought to complete the circle we began together hours ago, when we first pictured a Victorian woman standing straight and proper in her long dark dress. Before we knew everything we know now about what she wore underneath, what she survived, what she hoped for, what she quietly endured. There is a photograph, though you do not need to look at it now. You can simply imagine it with your eyes closed, a photograph from somewhere in the 1880s, taken in a London photography studio. A young woman sits very still on a simple chair, her hands folded in her lap, her dress dark and plain, her face serious the way faces always looked in old photographs, because exposures took so long that smiling became too difficult to maintain. If you could lift that photograph to the light and look very closely, you would see small signs of wear in her dress, a patch carefully sewn near the hem, fabric just slightly faded at the shoulders where sunlight or work had worn it thin. Her hands, resting so carefully in her lap, show slight redness at the knuckles, suggesting work, though what kind we can only guess. Laundry perhaps. Sewing. Something that required her hands to move through water or rough fabric hour after hour, day after day. We do not know her name. The photographer's studio that took this image is long gone. The dress she wore so carefully for this special occasion, this rare, expensive photograph meant to preserve her image for family or perhaps for a sweetheart far away, that dress dissolved back into fabric scraps, then dust, then nothing at all, decades ago. But her face remains, looking out across more than a century of distance, meeting our eyes with an expression we cannot quite read. Is she proud to be photographed, excited to have her image preserved? Is she uncomfortable in the formal setting, wishing it was over so she could return to familiar work? Is she thinking about someone specific who will see this photograph, someone she hopes will find her beautiful, properly dressed, worth remembering? We will never know. The inner life behind that serious face is lost to us completely, separated by time and death, and the simple fact that she left no diary, no letters, nothing but this single image to prove she existed at all. And yet something connects across that distance, doesn't it? She was human, exactly as human as you are now, lying in your bed in your own time. She felt cold mornings and the relief of warmth. She knew hunger and the satisfaction of eating. She experienced the weight of fabric against her skin, the particular discomfort of a too tight lacing, the pleasure of finally removing restrictive clothing at the end of a long day. She laughed at things we will never know about. She grieved losses we cannot name. She woke each morning and moved through her hours and returned to bed each night seeking exactly what you seek now: rest, peace, release from the endless demands of being alive. The specific objects that filled her life, the corset, the petticoats, the buttons and laces and pins, all of that is gone. But the human experience underneath all of it, the experience of inhabiting a body, of moving through time, of trying to belong and be seen and matter to someone, somewhere, that remains constant, unchanged, as true for her then as it is for you now. She is sleeping now, has been sleeping for longer than anyone who knew her name has been alive. And soon you will join her in that sleep. Not the permanent sleep that took her more than a century ago, but the temporary, nightly sleep that allows life to continue, that restores and heals and prepares you for another day of your own living, in your own time, wearing your own clothing that will someday seem just as strange to future eyes as her dark patched dress seems to us now. Let her rest. Let all of them rest. The queens and the servants and the factory workers and the seamstresses and the mothers and daughters. Everyone who ever laced a corset or pinned up their hair or walked carefully through muddy streets trying not to ruin their one good dress. They carried their burdens. They found their small joys. They survived what they could survive and let go of what they could not hold. And then they rested as you're resting now. The photograph is fading now, slipping back into archives and storage boxes, no longer needing your attention. The Victorian era is receding into comfortable distance, becoming once again what it always was, the past, interesting but finished, informative but not urgent, a story told and now complete. Your breathing is slow and steady. Your body is heavy and warm. The darkness behind your closed eyelids is peaceful and safe. There is nothing more you need to know tonight. Nothing more you need to remember or understand or figure out. Just sleep now. Just rest. The strange things Victorian women wore, all of it, the danger and the beauty and the ritual and the survival, all of it can wait until some other night if you ever want to return to it. Tonight, you are released from corsets and mourning rules and social expectations and the endless fascinating complexity of being human in any era, past or present. Tonight, you are simply you, breathing slowly in the darkness, safe and warm and free to sleep as deeply as you need. The story is finished. The women are at peace, and so are you. Sleep well.